Hi, this is Steve back at the Listening Post. Back in 1975, when I was still in high school, me and a couple of buddies got tickets to go see the Electric Light Orchestra at the San Jose Civic. And they were promoting an album that had just come out called Face the Music, and they had a hit single at the time called Evil Woman. Opening from that night was a band I was unfamiliar with at the time called Little Feat. And what I can tell you about that evening is that the Electric Light Orchestra were way too loud, and Little Feat put on one of the best shows I'd ever seen up to that point. They laid down a thick, funky groove and finished the show with an incredible boogie, and it was just unlike anything I'd seen up to that point. They kind of were known for combining the funky New Orleans sound of the 60s with 70s rock urban sensibilities, and they created a very kind of a timeless quality to their albums that still sound contemporary today. They were led by a guitarist, singer, and songwriter named Lowell George, who was a slide guitarist and a very influential musician on other slide guitarists, including Bonnie Raitt, Ben Harper, and blues guitarist Roy Rogers. Lowell George was born in 1945 in Hollywood, California. When he was just 5 years old, he was competing in talent contests, playing the harmonica. He was on the Arthur Godfrey Show, and another contestant in one of his talent contests was Frank Zappa, who performed a puppet show. Lowell George learned to play the guitar when he was 11 years old with a classmate, Paul Bear, who would later go on to become a member of Little Feat. He attended Hollywood High School right near the intersection of Sunset and Vine, and played flute in the marching band. He became so accomplished that he actually participated in several of Frank Sinatra's recording sessions, playing oboe and baritone saxophone. In 1965, he formed a band called The Factory with drummer Richie Hayward, who would later go on to become a member of Little Feat, and a lyricist named Martin Kibbe, who was a high school classmate. Martin Kibbe sometimes went by the pseudonym Fred Martin, and whenever he and Lowell George would co-write a tune together, they would put the songwriting credits down as George Martin, which was their tribute to George Martin, the Beatles' producer. Frank Zappa produced a couple of tracks for The Factory that were later released in 1993 on an album called Lightning Rod Man. When The Factory broke up, Lowell George briefly became the lead singer for the Standells, another one of those bands that was pretty popular in the mid-60s on the Sunset Strip. In 1968, George became the lead singer for Frank Zappa's the lead guitarist for Frank Zappa's Mothers of Invention. He was with the band about a year. He performed on the album Weasels Rip My Flesh. He also sang lead on a song called Here Lies Love that came out several years later on an album called You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore, Volume 5. There's no real consensus on why Lowell George left the Mothers of Invention. The original story I heard was that when he wrote the song Willin', Frank Zappa was so impressed that he said, you ought to go out and form your own band. Another story you'll hear is that he was fired for writing the song Willin' because it contained drug references, and Frank Zappa was very anti-drugs. Another version of the story is that Frank Zappa was upset that Lowell George performed a 15-minute guitar solo with his amplifier turned off. Whatever the truth is, there seems not to have been any animosity between Frank Zappa and Lowell George, because Frank Zappa was very instrumental in getting Little Feat their first record contract with Warner Brothers Records. After leaving the Mothers of Invention, Lowell George played in a band with Peter Tork of the Monkees. The two were good friends, and they were in a group called The Release. Later in 1969, Lowell George got back together with some of the members of The Factory. Richie Hayward had formed a band called the Fraternity of Man, which had Roy Estrada on bass. He was from the Mothers of Invention. They had a song called Don't Bogart Me, which was featured in the film Easy Rider in 1969. In 1970, Lowell George helped form Little Feat in Los Angeles with keyboardist Bill Payne, who had auditioned with the Mothers of Invention, Richie Hayward on drums from the Factory, Roy Estrada from the Factory, and Mothers of Invention on bass. They got their name from a comment made by Frank Zappa's drummer about the size of Lowell George's feet, and they changed the spelling to F-E-A-T as a tribute to the Beatles. They released their first album in January 1971. This shows a picture of the band standing in front of a mural in Venice, California called Venice in the Snow. It's got the first version of the song Willin' on it that is performed as an acoustic duet between Lowell George and Ry Cooder. Ry Cooder had also been in a band on the Sunset Strip. They were called the Native Sons, and that group included Taj Mahal in it. This is not an essential album to purchase. It's not the first one you want by Little Feat. They hadn't really developed their identity yet, but it does have a couple of good songs on it, including Snakes on Everything, written by Bill Payne, a Lowell George acoustic ballad called Truck Stop Girl. He also does one called Brides of Jesus, and I've Been the One, which featured Sneaky Pete Kleino of the Flying Burrito Brothers on pedal steel. I think the album's highlight is a track called Crack in Your Door, which is a pretty good rocker. In May 1972, Little Feat released their second album, Sailing Shoes. This is the first one to feature the artwork of Neon Park on the cover, and he would pretty much do all their albums' cover art. This was produced by Ted Templeton, who also was the producer for the Doobie Brothers. The Doobie Brothers were a San Jose bar band. They released their first album in '71, and it was kind of a light acoustic rock album. It did have one good song on it called Nobody, but it was more in the style of Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And when Ted Templeton came along, he was able to kind of capture their live sound and make them into a huge success. He produced Sailing Shoes, and it's got a couple of Lowell George classic compositions on it, Easy to Slip, Cold, Cold, Cold. Bill Payne and Richie Hayward co-wrote Tripe Face Boogie. It's also got a reworking of Willin', this time done with the whole band, and Sneaky Pete Kleino on pedal steel guitar. And they do a song called Apolitical Blues, which was inspired by Muddy Waters. Lowell George was a huge Muddy Waters fan. Neither of these albums sold especially well, and after the album was released, Roy Estrada, the bassist, left the group and went back to the Mothers of Invention, and later on would play with Captain Beefheart. The members of the group did a little bit of session work. They took some time off from the band. They worked on the Van Dyke Parks album Discover America, and also Robert Palmer's album Sneaking Sally Through the Alley, which was recorded in New Orleans. When the group got back together, Lowell George added New Orleans bassist Kenny Gradney, who had performed with Delaney and Bonnie. Sam Clayton was added as a percussionist, which basically gave the band two drummers, a la the Grateful Dead and the Allman Brothers, and Paul Barrere on guitar. They came out in late 1972 with the album Dixie Chicken. I think Sailing Shoes is their first classic. Dixie Chicken may be their best overall album. This is a tribute to New Orleans, and it's got the title track influenced the name of the Dixie Chicks. They took their name from the song Dixie Chicken. It's also got a couple of more Lowell George classic compositions, Two Trains Runnin' and Roll 'Em Easy. They do a cover of Alan Toussaint's song On Your Way Down, and they do a song called Fat Man in the Bathtub. Again, Frank Zappa influence. You know, he came out with a lot of whimsical song titles on his albums, and I think Lowell George was influenced by that. In 1974, Little Feat released an album called Feats Don't Fail Me Now. This is less eclectic than some of their other albums. It's basically a from beginning to end, kind of a funky, boogieing sort of an album, very representative of their live sound. It's got a song on it called The Fan with an extended jam on it that very much sounds like the band did in concert. They redo Tripe Face Boogie and Cold, Cold, Cold from previous albums. It's got a couple more Lowell George classic compositions, including Spanish Moon, Rock and Roll Doctor, and Feets Don't Fail Me Now. Bill Payne wrote the song Oh Atlanta, and Paul Breer wrote the song Skin It Back, both of which were performed regularly in concert. This album also has Emmylou Harris and Bonnie Raitt providing backing vocals. Lowell George at this time was becoming somewhat obsessed with producing a hit album. They were developing a cult following and were known as a great live band, but still really hadn't had a big hit. And Lowell George started spending more and more time in the studio trying to do things to increase the value of their recordings. He would do a lot of studio tricks that he learned from Frank Zappa, such as using tape splicing as a compositional tool. He'd splice songs together, then hand them off to Bill Payne and say, make it work. Tensions were beginning to simmer within the band. Lowell George's drug use was beginning to become a bit of a problem. In 1975, they released an album called The Last Record Album, which was kind of an inside joke because they thought every album had the potential to be the last record album. Bill Payne and Paul Breer took over the musical direction of the band and started to steer it in more of a jazz fusion direction, away from the New Orleans funk that they were primarily known for. It's got a couple of good songs on it. A Lowell George composition called Long Distance Love, and also Paul Breer and Bill Payne combined for All That You Dream, another one of their better songs. In 1977, they released an album called Time Loves a Hero. They brought back Ted Templeton of the Doobie Brothers to produce this album for them. Lowell George's drug use was becoming such a problem that he contracted hepatitis and really did not participate much at all in this recording, other than contributing the song Rocket in My Pocket. The band did a song called Day at the Dog Races, which was kind of a jazz fusion instrumental that Lowell George evidently did not like at all. He thought it made the band sound like Weather Report. They performed in Germany on the Rock Palace musical television show, and that concert was released on this DVD, Little Feat Rock Palace, and that gives you a pretty good idea of how they looked and sounded at that time. 1979, they went to work on an album called Down on the Farm. Lowell George pretty much dropped out of the group midway through this and began work on his his solo debut, Thanks I'll Eat It Here. Waiting for Columbus came out in 1978. This pretty much came out at about the time that the band was peaking in popularity. And it's basically a greatest hits live. It's a good album. I've got the 2 CD Rhino remastered edition of this, which is the one to get. In 1979, Lowell George released Thanks I'll Eat It Here, his solo debut. They do a cover of the Alan Toussaint song, What Do You Want the Girl to Do? And there's a couple of good Lowell George compositions on here, Honest Man, and another acoustic ballad, 20 Million Things. He went on tour to promote this album and had a massive heart attack and died, which may have been brought on by his drug abuse and cocaine in particular. Some of the other band members said he was heavy into something called speedballing, which is what killed John Belushi. The band released Down on the Farm after his death, and then a rarities collection called Hoy Hoy came out in 1981. They regrouped in 1988 and brought over Greg Fuller from Pure Prairie League. Pure Prairie League, really cool kind of a country rock band. They did a song called Amy that I like a lot, and had another hit with a song called Two Lane Highway. Timothy Schmidt, the bassist for the Eagles, also came out of Pure Prairie League. The band continues to perform to this day. In 1998, Sanctuary Records released a tribute to Lowell George called Rock and Roll Doctor. And Little Feat's songs have been covered by countless artists. Linda Ronstadt has covered several of their songs: Willin', Roll 'Em Easy, All That You Dream. Emmylou Harris covered Oh Atlanta. Steve Earle covered Willin'. Bonnie Raitt covered Taking My Time on her album Sweet Forgiveness and Fool Yourself. Taj Mahal has covered Feats Don't Fail Me Now. Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead covered Easy to Slip on his solo album Heaven Help the Fool. And John Sebastian covered Dixie Chicken on his album Tarzana Kid. Well, that's all I got. Once again, the full essay is available on the Totally Guitars website. And I thank you very much for listening. This is Steve at the Listening Post, and we will see you next time.